On the 21st of March 1960, in a township south of Johannesburg called Sharpeville, 69 people died in a field. They had gathered peacefully, no weapons, no barricades, to protest the past laws, the system of documentation that required every black South African to carry a book of papers authorizing their movement through the country of their birth. The demonstration was orderly. The crowd dispersed, and the South African police opened fire on their backs. 69 dead, 180 wounded. The majority of the dead shot in the back, which is what it looks like when people are running away. That is not where this story begins, but that is where the door closes. Welcome to Portraits of the Past, where we explore the lives of those whose legacies continue to echo through time. In the weeks that followed Sharpeville, the South African government did not retreat. It accelerated. A state of emergency was declared. 2,000 activists were detained. And on the 8th of April 1960, both the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress were formally banned, stripped of legal existence, forbidden to organize, forbidden to meet, forbidden in any practical sense to function as political organizations within the borders of South Africa. The African National Congress had operated imperfectly and under constant pressure for 48 years. It had marched, it had petitioned, it had sent delegations to Pretoria, to London, to the United Nations. It had organized work stoppages and stay-at-homes. It had, for nearly 5 decades, pursued political change through the instruments of law, organization, and peaceful demonstration, against a state that consistently met its efforts with violence, with contempt, or with silence. Now, in the spring of 1960, the state had made the organization illegal. There was a man in Johannesburg who understood, with the precision of a trained lawyer, exactly what that meant. He was 41 years old when the ANC was banned. He had been a member since his early 20s. He had helped forge its youth league, the faction that pushed the organization toward more direct confrontation with apartheid, and away from the measured tones of a leadership he considered insufficiently urgent. His name, by 1960, was well known to the South African security apparatus, which had been monitoring him, harassing him, and attempting to constrain him through banning orders for years. His name was Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. To understand how he navigated the crisis of 1960, you have to look at the architecture of the man who had arrived in Johannesburg 2 decades earlier. The image the world eventually constructed around him, the elderly statesman, the moral monument, the reconciler, tends to arrive before the man himself, and it tends to soften what it touches. The man himself was something considerably more difficult to contain. He had grown up in the Transkei, the son of a Tembu chief's counselor, raised with a sense of lineage and obligation that was not abstract. He attended Fort Hare University, the institution that educated much of an entire generation of African political leadership, where he met Oliver Tambo, who would become his closest political partner, and where he encountered for the first time the organized anger of young men who understood that the world as it was had been deliberately constructed to keep them in place. When his guardian arranged a marriage he had not chosen, he did what young men with large ambitions and a clear sense of their own possibilities frequently do. He left. He walked away from the Transkei, arrived in Johannesburg in 1941 with almost nothing, and began building a life in a city that was simultaneously the engine of South Africa's industrial wealth and the site of some of the most complete and systematic human degradation the country had yet devised. He found Walter Sisulu. Sisulu found him work and, eventually, a position reading law at a firm in the city. He read for it with the seriousness of a man who understood that the law was power, that it was the architecture inside which everything else was decided, and that black South Africans had been kept largely outside it by deliberate design. He qualified. He and Oliver Tambo opened a practice in the center of Johannesburg. It was, in the early 1950s, a statement in itself. Two black attorneys in the middle of a city built to render that fact invisible. The clients arrived before the doors had finished opening. The pass laws, the Group Areas Act, the Population Registration Act. Apartheid generated an inexhaustible supply of people who needed the law and could not easily reach it. Through all of it, through the marches and the campaigns and the Defiance Campaign of 1952, when the ANC organized thousands of volunteers to deliberately violate unjust laws and accept imprisonment as a witness to their injustice, through all of it, the approach was nonviolent, deliberately, not as a concession, not as a tactic chosen for want of alternatives, but as a principled commitment that Mandela held and defended and argued for over years, against a state that never once reciprocated it. The state fired into crowds. The state arrested organizers and banned individuals by name, restricting where they could travel, who they could meet, which gatherings they could address. It built, piece by careful piece, a machinery of racial exclusion of extraordinary sophistication and reach. And the ANC, year after year, continued to march, to petition, to organize, and to absorb the consequences. Sharpeville changed the arithmetic, not immediately, not without argument, not without genuine and serious disagreement among people who had given years of their lives to the nonviolent approach and believed, with considerable evidence available to support them, that the international shock the massacre had produced might still generate the political pressure that peaceful protest had so far failed to force. Inside the ANC and among its allies, the debate that followed was real, and the people on both sides of it were serious. Abandoning nonviolence was not a decision that moved through these ranks without resistance. There were moral arguments against it. There were strategic arguments. There were people who had built their entire political lives around the discipline of peaceful resistance, who understood what it cost and who believed that cost had meaning, that it was itself part of the argument being made to the world. Mandela heard those arguments. He had made versions of them himself. But the banning had dismantled the legal architecture. The state of emergency had cleared the streets. The pass laws remained in force, unchanged. The government had not retreated from the system it was operating by a single deliberate inch. And the system it was operating had just shot 69 people in the back, declared the organization trying to change it illegal, and waited to see what would happen next. He worked his way, carefully and without pleasure, toward a conclusion he did not want to reach. In June of 1961, the armed wing of the liberation movement came into being. It was called Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation. Mandela was its first commander. The doctrine the organization adopted at its founding was specific, documented, and must be rendered with the precision it deserves rather than the convenience that hindsight sometimes provides. It was a doctrine of sabotage. The targets were infrastructure and economic assets. The explicit stated prohibition was against operations likely to cause human casualties. This was not an oversight in the planning. It was a deliberate moral and strategic position, a graduated escalation designed to apply economic and political pressure while minimizing loss of life. The distinction between that founding doctrine and indiscriminate violence is not a rhetorical convenience. It is the difference between a decision made by people who had thought carefully about what they were choosing and one made by people who had not. Mandela had thought carefully. He had been thinking carefully for years, and he understood with the clarity of a man trained in the law the precise weight of what he was now placing on the scales of his own future. He was already living underground by the time MK's first operations launched. He could no longer move openly. He traveled under assumed names. He slept in borrowed houses, met contacts in back rooms, communicated through intermediaries. The man who had built his entire life around the instruments of law was now living entirely outside the protection those instruments were designed to provide. Not because he had discarded his principles, but because the law had been turned against him as a weapon. In 1962, he left South Africa for the first time. He crossed the continent, Algeria, Ethiopia, Ghana, Egypt, and others, seeking the support, military training, and political engagement of leaders who understood the South African liberation struggle as part of something larger than the version the apartheid government preferred to present to the world. He traveled to London and met with Oliver Tambo, who had been operating in exile since the banning. He spoke with journalists, with politicians, with liberation movement figures who occupied a world where the South African government's claim to legitimacy was viewed with considerably less deference than it received at home. Then he came back. On the 5th of August, 1962, a car was stopped on the road near Hoyek in KwaZulu-Natal. The man inside had been underground for 17 months. He was arrested. How the security apparatus located him and who provided the information that brought them to that road on that afternoon remains a contested question in the historical record. What is not contested is what followed: a trial, a conviction, and a sentence of 5 years imprisonment for incitement to strike and for leaving the country without travel documents. Not yet the Rivonia charges, which would come later in a separate and far graver proceeding. This was its own distinct reckoning, and it is worth being precise about what it was. A cell, a prisoner number in place of a name, and the knowledge, carried in by a man who had spent his adult life studying how the apparatus of state power worked, that the organization he had helped build was still operating without him in the open, doing the work he had concluded needed to be done. He had understood when he made his decision that this was among the places it might lead. He had made the decision anyway. That is the specific weight of it, not the warm verdict that history eventually delivered, dressed in international recognition and the long dignity of survival, but the particular gravity of a choice made forward into the dark by a man who could not yet see how it ended, only what it had already cost and what it was likely to cost further. The trial was still coming. The larger reckoning, the one the world would watch. He had already decided what he was going to say when he got there. The paint is dry on this chapter, but the archives are vast. Subscribe and return to portraits of the past. The next exhibit awaits.